When free markets need protection, the automotive version. Picture this: a closed-door meeting in Washington, D.C. On one side of the table sit executives from America's biggest car makers, polished shoes, crisp suits, PowerPoints loaded with charts of unfair competition. On the other side sit politicians who owe their careers, in part, to jobs in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee. The message from the automakers is simple: Chinese cars must be kept out. They argue that Chinese manufacturers are unfairly subsidized by Beijing, that their low prices threaten American jobs, and that the only responsible move is to raise barriers, tariffs, regulations, maybe even outright bans. But here's the uncomfortable twist. These same US car makers have been propped up by their own government for decades through bailouts, tax breaks, and a regulatory environment that often shields them from true global competition. During the 2008-2009 financial crisis alone, General Motors and Chrysler received tens of billions of dollars in emergency support from the US Treasury to avoid collapse. So whose subsidies are fair? Whose protection is necessary? And whose version of the free market are we really defending? Question: when you hear an industry demand protection from unfair competition, do you instinctively think of national security or of incumbents trying to keep their grip on power? The Chinese car is the new bogeyman. For over a century, the American car has been a symbol. Chrome-plated freedom, V8 independence, the open road. Today, that symbol is under pressure from something very different: sleek, software-heavy, aggressively priced electric vehicles from China. Chinese automakers, especially in the EV space, have grown under a deliberate industrial strategy. For years, Beijing has offered purchase subsidies for EV buyers, tax exemptions on new energy vehicles, cheap credit and land for factories, support for battery supply chains and raw materials. The result is a wave of Chinese brands: BYD, NIO, XPeng, SAIC joint ventures able to build EVs at scale and often at lower cost than many Western rivals. These cars are already reshaping markets in Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. US automakers see the writing on the wall. If those same vehicles enter the American market at scale, they could undercut domestic prices, especially in the lower and mid-range segments where many US brands have either retreated or grown complacent. The response has been political. Calls for high tariffs, national security reviews, and regulatory barriers framed as data privacy or cybersecurity concerns. Are Chinese automakers subsidized? Yes, heavily, in many cases. But here's the key question: is that fundamentally different from what the US has done for its own carmakers when they were in trouble or when they needed a push into new technologies? Question: if a Chinese EV is safer, cleaner, and cheaper than its US counterpart, should you be prevented from buying it in the name of fairness to US companies? A short history of American auto subsidies by another name. Let's rewind to 2008-2009. The global financial system is cracking. Credit markets freeze. Car sales collapse. Two of the big three US automakers, GM and Chrysler, are on the brink of failure. To prevent a chain reaction of plant closures, supplier bankruptcies, and mass layoffs, the US government steps in. Through the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, Washington created the Automotive Industry Financing Program. GM ultimately receives around $50 billion in support. Chrysler receives billions more. The total commitment to the auto sector, including related programs, is often cited at roughly $85 billion, though not all of that was ultimately lost. Some was repaid, some recouped through stock sales. Still, estimates suggest taxpayers did not fully recover the nominal value of the assistance, with losses on the order of $14 billion. What do we call that? When Beijing injects capital into a struggling automaker, we call it a subsidy. When Washington injects capital into GM and Chrysler, we call it a bailout or emergency stabilization. Functionally, they're very similar. Government money used to keep a domestic industry alive, preserve jobs, and maintain industrial capacity. And that's just the dramatic crisis-era support. US automakers have also benefited from tax incentives for domestic manufacturing and R&D. State and local subsidies for plants, land grants, tax abatements, infrastructure. Consumer tax credits that effectively support demand for certain vehicles, e.g., EV credits that benefit domestic producers. The language changes incentives, relief, support, restructuring assistance, but the economic reality is that the U.S. auto industry has not lived in a pure free market environment for a long time. Question: when you think about the 2008-2009 bailouts, do you see them as a necessary rescue or as proof that the U.S. auto industry has long relied on the very kind of state support it now criticizes in China? Industrial policy, American style versus Chinese style. It's tempting to frame this as a morality play. We are free market. They are state-controlled. But the truth is more nuanced. Both the US and China practice industrial policy, they just do it differently and talk about it differently. Chinese industrial policy in autos. China's strategy has been explicit. Pick strategic sectors, like EVs and batteries. Flood them with support subsidies, cheap loans, land, and regulatory preferences. Use scale to drive down costs and dominate global supply chains. The goal is not just domestic mobility. It's global leadership in a future-defining industry. U.S. industrial policy in autos. The U.S. approach has been more fragmented and often reactive. Crisis-driven bailouts, e.g., GM and Chrysler in 2008-2009. Tax credits and incentives for EVs, batteries, and domestic manufacturing expanded in recent legislation. State-level competition to attract plants with generous packages sometimes worth hundreds of millions or more in foregone tax revenue. The rhetoric, however, is different. U.S. support is often framed as leveling the playing field, protecting American jobs, ensuring national security, investing in innovation. China's support is more openly about building national champions and dominating future industries. But if you're a consumer, the labels matter less than the outcome. Both systems use public resources to shape the auto market. Question: is it more honest to admit that every major auto-producing country uses industrial policy, or to pretend that only your rivals do? The myth of the American car in a globalized supply chain. Walk around a dealership lot in the US, and you'll see flags, slogans, and badges that scream "Built in America" or "American made." But pop the hood on the supply chain, and the story gets murkier. Modern vehicles are mosaics of global sourcing. Electronics from Asia. Transmissions or engines from Europe or Mexico. Seats, wiring harnesses, and interior components from suppliers scattered across continents. Many American models are assembled in Mexico, Canada, or elsewhere, while some foreign brands build extensively in US plants. The auto industry is deeply globalized by design because it lowers costs and boosts profits. At the same time, US automakers have closed plants in traditional industrial regions, shifted production to lower-cost countries, used global platforms to standardize parts and reduce expenses. So when US carmakers argue that Chinese vehicles are unfair because they're made abroad with state support, it's worth remembering. US companies themselves have spent decades optimizing their own global footprints, often at the expense of domestic manufacturing jobs. And yet, despite this global sourcing and offshoring, US consumers are often still paying high prices, especially in segments where competition is limited or where brand loyalty is strong. Question: when you buy a car, do you feel you're supporting a national industry or a global corporation that optimizes for its own bottom line first? Data, trust, and the new oil under the hood. There's another layer to this story that didn't exist in the muscle car era. Data. Modern vehicles are rolling computers. They collect location data, driving behavior, speed, braking, acceleration, in-car infotainment usage. Sometimes, even voice interactions and phone integration details. Reports and investigations in recent years have raised concerns that some automakers and their partners have monetized this data sharing or selling it to third parties, including insurers and data brokers, often in ways that are not obvious to the average driver. So while US automakers warn that Chinese cars might pose a data privacy or cybersecurity risk, there's a parallel question. How responsibly have U.S. companies handled the data they already collect from American drivers? If a U.S. automaker mine your driving data, sells or shares it with third parties, uses it to adjust insurance risk scores or target you with ads, is that fundamentally more ethical than a hypothetical Chinese automaker doing something similar? The concern about foreign access to data is real and serious. But it sits on top of a domestic ecosystem where data extraction has already become a business model. Question: do you actually know what your current car manufacturer does with your data, and if not, why are you more afraid of a foreign brand than of the one already in your driveway? Labor, unions, and the cost of misaligned incentives. The U.S. auto industry has long been a battleground for labor and capital. Unionized plants, especially in the Midwest, built a middle class. Over time, though, pressures from global competition, automation, and management decisions eroded that stability. You mentioned something important: union training funds and luxury escapades. Over the years, there have been documented cases where funds intended for worker training or joint labor management programs were misused, spent on lavish travel, entertainment, or perks for a small group of insiders rather than on the rank-and-file workforce. These scandals have involved both union and management figures in some instances, and they've damaged trust on all sides. At the same time, U.S. automakers have negotiated concessions from workers during crises, closed or restructured plants, introduced tiers of wages and benefits that leave younger workers with less security than their predecessors. Yet, even in tough times, upper management often remained insulated from the worst pain. During the 2008-2009 crisis, while workers faced layoffs, buyouts, and plant closures, executives at major automakers still received substantial compensation packages, sometimes adjusted, but rarely in proportion to the sacrifices demanded of the broader workforce. The result is a perception, often justified, that the system is asymmetric. Workers absorb the downside. Executives capture the upside. Question: when you hear about shared sacrifice in an industry downturn, do you believe that sacrifice is truly shared from the shop floor to the executive suite? Executive compensation: America versus China. Let's talk about the people at the very top. In the US, executive compensation in the auto industry has followed the broader corporate trend. Large base salaries, bonuses, stock awards, and long-term incentive plans. It's not unusual for the CEO of a major U.S. automaker to earn total annual compensation in the tens of millions of dollars, especially in profitable years. By contrast, many Chinese automakers operate under different norms. Some are state-owned or state-controlled, where executive pay is more tightly regulated and often lower in cash terms. Others are private or publicly listed, where founders or major shareholders may earn relatively modest official salaries but hold large equity stakes. This makes direct apples-to-apples comparisons tricky. A Chinese auto executive might show a lower official salary but still wield enormous wealth and influence through ownership. A U.S. executive's compensation is often more transparent in filings but also more visibly disconnected from average worker pay. What matters for our discussion is perception and structure. In the US, high executive pay in a bailed-out industry feels like privatized gains, socialized losses. In China, state influence can mean executives are more constrained in visible pay, but the trade-off is less transparency, more political control, and different forms of privilege. From the standpoint of a US car buyer struggling with high prices, the optics are stark. You're told that Chinese cars are unfair because of subsidies, while the executives of domestic firms that have themselves been rescued with public money are richly rewarded. How much were GM and Chrysler top executives making during the 2008 financial crash? General Motors, GM. CEO Rick Wagoner's 2008 compensation. Rick Wagoner received a total compensation package valued at $14.9 million in 2008. Breakdown: about $11.9 million of that was in stock and options, which later collapsed in value as GM's share price fell below $2. His base salary was restored to $2.2 million in 2008 after a previous pay cut. Context: GM lost $30.9 billion in 2008 and was relying on government loans to stay afloat. GM ultimately received over $50 billion in federal assistance through TARP. Chrysler. Executive compensation during the crisis. Chrysler's CEO compensation for 2008 is not directly listed in the search results, but we do have verified data on what Chrysler's top executives were receiving during the bailout request period. Chrysler paid about $30 million in retention bonuses to roughly 50 top executives, while simultaneously asking Congress for bailout funds. Details. At least 6 Chrysler executives were each scheduled to receive more than $1 million in bonuses through August 2009. Context. These bonuses were part of a retention plan created in 2007 under Daimler Chrysler, but they became highly controversial because Chrysler was simultaneously cutting thousands of jobs, requesting federal rescue loans. Chrysler was one of the companies that received TARP assistance, alongside GM. Question. When you see the price tag on a new car, do you ever wonder how much of it is effectively underwriting a compensation system at the top that would be unthinkable for the average worker? Monopoly, choice, and the invisible cost to the consumer. Let's get to the heart of your frustration. The feeling that U.S. buyers are trapped in a de facto monopoly environment. The U.S. auto market is not a pure monopoly. There are multiple brands, including foreign ones, competing. But there are structural features that can make it feel like a cartel-like ecosystem from the consumer's perspective. Limited access to low-cost foreign competitors, e.g., Chinese brands kept out by tariffs or regulatory barriers. Dealer franchise laws that restrict direct-to-consumer sales in many states, protecting legacy dealer networks and adding layers of cost and complexity. Concentration in certain segments, where only a few major players dominate: pickup trucks, full-size SUVs, or specific EV categories. In a truly open market, if a foreign automaker can deliver a safe, reliable, efficient car at a significantly lower price, it would pressure incumbents to lower prices or improve value. When those competitors are blocked, whether for legitimate security reasons or for protectionist motives, consumers pay the price in the form of higher average transaction prices, fewer low-cost options, slower innovation in segments where incumbents feel secure. This is especially painful in a brutal economy where wages for many workers have not kept pace with the cost of living. Auto loans stretch longer and longer, 70 to 84 months. Insurance, maintenance, and fuel or electricity costs add to the burden. So when U.S. automakers argue that Chinese cars should be kept out to protect American jobs, the question becomes: who is protecting the American consumer? Question. If you had the option tomorrow to buy a significantly cheaper, well-built Chinese ever compact car, would you want that choice even if it made life harder for U.S. automakers? National security or economic security for incumbents? There is a serious argument that foreign-made connected cars, especially from geopolitical rivals, could pose national security risks. They might collect sensitive location data, be vulnerable to remote interference, integrate with critical infrastructure in ways that create systemic risk. Those concerns should not be dismissed. But they also shouldn't be used as a blank check to shield domestic industries from any and all competition. A balanced approach would set clear, transparent security and data privacy standards that apply to all automakers selling in the U.S., domestic or foreign. Require onshore data storage, strict limits on data sharing, and robust cybersecurity audits. Allow foreign vehicles that meet these standards to compete rather than banning them outright on vague grounds. If, instead, national security becomes a catch-all justification for keeping out cheaper, competitive vehicles, it risks becoming what unfair subsidies already is: a rhetorical tool to defend incumbents. Question. How do we draw the line between legitimate security concerns and convenient excuses for economic protectionism? What a genuinely fair market for car buyers would look like. Let's imagine, for a moment, a car market that actually puts the buyer at the center. It might look like this. Transparent industrial policy. If the U.S. chooses to support its auto industry through tax credits, subsidies, or bailouts, it does so openly. with clear goals and sunset clauses, and with conditions that ensure benefits flow not just to shareholders and executives, but to workers and consumers. Open but secure competition. Foreign automakers, including Chinese ones, can sell in the US if they meet strict, uniformly applied standards for safety, cybersecurity, and data privacy. No double standards. Real accountability for data use. Every automaker must clearly disclose what data they collect, how it's used, and with whom it's shared, and give drivers meaningful control over it. Executive pay tied to broader outcomes. Compensation at the top is linked not just to stock price, but to long-term metrics like product quality, worker stability, and customer satisfaction. Dealer and distribution reform. Outdated laws that lock in high-cost distribution models are revisited, allowing more flexible, consumer-friendly ways to buy and service vehicles. In such a market, US automakers would still have advantages: brand recognition, existing infrastructure, and deep engineering talent. But they would have to earn their position every year, not rely on political shields. Question: if you could redesign one rule of the auto market to make it fairer for buyers, what would you change first? Pricing transparency, data rights, executive accountability, or something else entirely? Conclusion: a call to action and some food for thought. You've put your finger on a deep hypocrisy. US automakers, long beneficiaries of government support, now argue that Chinese competitors are unfair because they are supported by their government. They invoke the free market while lobbying to limit your choices. They warn about foreign data risks while quietly building their own data-driven revenue streams. They talk about jobs and sacrifice while executive compensation remains stratospheric and consumers struggle under record-high vehicle prices. So what do we do with that? Your leverage as a citizen and a buyer. You may not sit in those closed-door meetings, but you're not powerless. As a voter, support policies that demand transparency in subsidies and bailouts: who gets what, under what conditions, and with what obligations to workers and consumers. Push for clear, consistent rules on data privacy and cybersecurity that apply to all automakers, not just foreign ones. As a consumer, demand clarity from dealers and manufacturers about pricing, fees, and data practices. Support brands, domestic or foreign, that demonstrate genuine respect for your wallet, your privacy, and your intelligence. As a voice in the public debate, challenge simplistic narratives about unfair Chinese subsidies that ignore our own history of bailouts and incentives. Ask whether protectionist measures are truly about national security or about shielding incumbents from competition that might finally force them to deliver better value. Food for thought. Let's end with the question beneath all the others. We've accepted, for decades, a system where losses are socialized in the name of saving jobs. Gains are privatized in the form of executive pay and shareholder returns. And the consumer, the person who just wants a safe, reliable, affordable car, is told that limiting their choices is somehow in their best interest. Now, as Chinese automakers rise and the old guard runs back to Washington for protection, we're being asked to accept that pattern again. So here's the thought I'd leave you with. If a free market only exists until it threatens the profits of powerful incumbents, and if national security is invoked whenever consumers might finally get a better deal, then maybe the real competition we need isn't just between US and Chinese carmakers. It's between two visions of whose interests an economy should serve. Will the next chapter of the auto industry be written to protect corporations from competition, or to give you, the buyer, the freedom of choice that the word freedom on a license plate is supposed to mean? That's not just a policy question. It's a values question. And it's one we can't afford to leave idling in neutral. Please tell me what you think and how you feel about this issue. Analyze it, brainstorm it, debate it, and if you like it, please share it. Thank you for watching. I truly and highly appreciate you, and God bless you.